Hello, salam, namaste. I'm Dr. Shiza Mohsin, and you're with me on Dil Ki Recipes on your favorite social media platform. Welcome. I'm hoping this becomes one of your sources of balanced, research-based, and culturally informed information for you and your Desi family in America. I am Dr. Shiza Mohsin, relationship expert and coach, and your virtual coach in life and relationships. Now, if you identify as a Desi, with cultural roots from Pakistan, India, Bangladesh, even Sri Lanka, Nepal, and all neighboring regions, trying to meet your life and relationship needs and desires while embracing some beautiful elements of your cultural heritage, Dil Ki Recipes is a website and a platform for you. The goal is to bring to you information, resources, as well as a lot of reflection and insight on our cultural nuances. And for our session today, I have the pleasure of introducing to you my friend and colleague, Jennifer Rupert. Jennifer has a master's in counseling psychology, as well as another master's in intercultural management. She has a diversity of experience that she works with multiple clients on. She's lived in many parts of the US, and today's focus is on noticing and understanding how the American people experience a Desi person in America. What was the motivation behind doing this? It was because we interact with the rest of the world and we have these cultural nuances about us. So I am hoping that this will become a valuable show that you can share with your American friends, family members about insight, and will hopefully give them the courage to ask you other questions as well. But Jennifer seemed like the perfect person to invite into this conversation. And she's actually going to be asking me lots of questions that typical Americans are curious about as it relates to the Desi community. Welcome, Jennifer.
Thank you, Shiza. It's an absolute pleasure to be here with you. And I am just so privileged to join you in this effort at this time when not everyone is having conversations. So thank you.
Thank you for saying that, Jennifer. And you and I met more than 20 years ago when we were doing our first set of training and certification to become coaches. And I think we met in Chicago, and
Yes.
we've had a great working and personal friendship and relationship. So I am so excited that you will be the one initiating this particular podcast and YouTube recording, as well as the different reels that everybody's going to see about, typical questions that sometimes are okay to ask and sometimes people feel a little uncomfortable asking.
Yeah, I was really fascinated when you asked me to participate in this because, as you know, I'm sort of in my kind of a progressive bubble. I've worked in higher ed and consulting most of my adult life, and that's generally a pretty accepting and curious environment. But there are a lot of environments that are less so, that are less progressive. So today I plan to ask you some questions that I think I might ask or people that I might work with might ask. But I also want to stretch a little bit and maybe ask some other questions that maybe other people from the community or various communities might want to ask. I will do my best.
Awesome. Let's go. And I'm very excited and curious about your questions, Jennifer.
Well, I think the first thing I want to ask is what is Desi? Coming from my background, I lived in a very international city for a long time. I've lived in lots of different places. And Desi, although I'm familiar with the word Desi, I don't know that a lot of people are.
Fantastic question to begin our conversation. So Desi, which is spelled Desi, is the term that a lot of South Asians have affinity with. The root is actually a combination of the language Urdu as well as Sanskrit. And it comes from the term Desh, which is Desh, and Desh means country. So Desi is somebody or something from the country. So Desi food would be from that part of the world because Desh means the cumulative country that was that region that once existed as just one country.
Yeah, that's an interesting question too, because I know, for example, that Pakistan and India and all of these places, like you say, used to be one country. And I know that they're not anymore. Can you tell me about, I don't even want to call them divisions, but can you tell me about the differences and how they appear in people's identity or how people feel about it in a Desi identity?
Beautiful question. So, a lot of it, Jennifer, is stemming from the time when the British ruled that part of the world. And in the 40s and then the 60s and 70s is when the countries started separating as they were gaining independence. So 1947 is the year that India and Pakistan separated, and 1971 is the year that Bangladesh became its own country. Before that, it was called East Pakistan. So it was a part of Pakistan, and then there was another war. So they've been through a lot of tragedy together as well. And what defines them are very interesting components. So within India and Pakistan, faith was a big element. So majority of Pakistanis are Muslims. Whereas the majority percentage, even though there are lots of Muslims that are in India even today, where majority of them were Hindu. And then with Bangladesh, it was a language separation. So very interesting because there's faith commonalities in all, but Bangladeshis are people who speak the Bengali language. And it's very, very interesting and complicated because there's so many languages in that culture, and those languages exist in all parts of that region. So there is a Punjab province and Punjabi language that is in Pakistan, but there is a Punjab region in India as well. A lot of the nuances in that cultural region have overlapping themes, and that's why there's so much common ground, especially as it relates to relationships, family dynamics, cultural foods, etc.
And I love that you mentioned common ground. I'm going to come back to that. But I'm learning even right now. And as you know, I consider myself a fairly educated person. But when we
You
talked about it
are.
before, I said, that I understand that Islam is a minority, but a giant minority. And I didn't realize that the majority of people in Pakistan were Muslim. I just knew of the giant minority in India. So this is super helpful. And I also didn't know that there was a language difference in Bangladesh. So I'm learning. Even right now, I'm learning. And so you were talking about the different languages, and I'm also thinking about the different religions. And we talk about Hindu versus is not versus, but Hindu and Islam. And what are some of the other religions that are there? And again, is this an idea that sort of separates people, or is it a unifying idea within the Daisy?
It's a very interesting question. I can share with you my perspective and what I see. I noticed that yes, maybe the countries were divided because of religion, but I see so much common ground that I feel that we have a lot more that we are united about. Our sense of family, how we do relationships, cultural expectations of parents from children, and marriage, huge element that is very common in terms of how it's carried out, in terms of expectations and relationship dynamics. So there's a lot that is there. The first part of your question, I want to make sure that I mention is the religious factor. So yes, Pakistan majority Muslim, India majority Hindu. I would say almost 80% of India is majority Hindu, but there are so many other faiths as well. In Bangladesh as well, significant amount of Muslims. There's Hinduism, and there's Islam, and then there is Sikhism, then there is Christianity. There's a very, very insignificant amount of Jewish people in that region, but still, I want to say they are there. And then they're the minority faiths in that region, like Baha'ism, Zoroastrianism, and Buddhism. So you have people following all of those faiths as well in the community. So it's really interesting when you walk into Toronto. I'll give that example because it's happened with me. And North America, includes, Canada as well, is where I'm standing at a Chinese restaurant. And the person who looks East Asian is talking in Urdu, in my language. And they're from Pakistan. So there's a lot of little nuances and reflections of different faiths as well. But I am sure that there's so much cultural influence that brings it together. And part of the reason why I use Desi a lot in my practice is that I practice based on cultural competence. And there's a lot of common ground when it comes to the culture of India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, and neighboring countries.
Well, and that's such an interesting thing too. And I said I wanted to come back to common ground. I think we'll keep coming back to the idea of common ground. And I love that you're talking about common ground within all those different countries and within the Daisy community. And I think that's lovely, and I see it. And then I think, Now I'm thinking from the American perspective or from an American perspective.
Mhm.
In my case, progressive American perspective. But I think anyone who sort of cares and wants to be inclusive and inviting. So while you're talking about common ground that you have, we don't want to assume that it's all common. We don't want to assume that everyone in any group is all the same. And as I mentioned to you before, I've spoken to other people before I came here and I said, I have this great opportunity to talk with someone about, to ask questions about the Desi community. What kind of questions do you have? And I'm consistently getting people not asking specific questions, but saying, I really care and I want to include people from all over, not just Daisy, but I'm afraid to ask questions because I'm afraid to accidentally insult people. And I'm afraid of exposing my assumptions, even if I don't feel like I have harmful assumptions. And so I was wondering if we could talk a little bit about that. I would like to know if you don't have to share anything super specific, but if there have been questions that maybe you knew were good natured or well intentioned that were still hurtful or offensive, if there are any ideas that you have that can help people who want to be curious and welcoming to not put their foot in their mouth.
I love it. I love the question because every community will talk about the other community as, whether it could be white Americans or Desi Americans. It's like, oh my God, you cannot believe this person asked me that question. So there are lots of moments where, and I want to say that with a non-judgmental disposition, that I know the intention was good. It's just that, when we're limited in our exposure, we end up asking questions that may not land as well. So I've had all kinds of questions about my faith. So I'm a Muslim, but I don't cover. So there's all kinds of questions on, does your father or your husband allow you to do that? Or somebody from the culture. The funniest and most harmless one is somebody will ask me if I know somebody by the name of whose name is Muhammad. And I'll be like, yeah, like 500,000 people have that name because it's a name of holy prophet. And so everybody's name, a lot of the men, their names include the word Muhammad, and the way it's structured, it ends up being the first name for many, many Muslims. They may have a different name. And then similarly, I was talking to an Indian friend of mine, and their last name is Patel. If you say that, you know somebody and whose last name is Patel, there are hundreds of thousands of people with that name. It basically exposes the idea that you may just know 5 people from that culture. When I meet you, Jennifer, I can never assume anything because we know enough white people to know that they're not all the same. But when you're talking about a minority, you make assumptions based on the 3 people that you know.
So it sounds like the idea is to just try not to make assumptions even when asking a question. I guess the people who are not asking the questions, it is a challenge, and they're just gonna, I think.
So I'm going to give you a tip.
The tip is good.
The tip would be on how to ask the questions. So what I know of your culture is that women have less privilege than men do. Is that the case in your family? So when you separate culture from the person's family or upbringing, it's a very different experience. So culture and family, then you're just being curious and open to know where on the spectrum this person is.
Yeah. Well, and also separating a person's knowledge by stating, this is what I know, that what they know could be incorrect.
Or limited.
What I've learned. Interesting.
And when you personalize it to say, when I met my friend Shiza, she had this in her home. Is that something you guys do as well? Because she is from Pakistan and she is a Muslim. So you are basically framing your context and the limitation of your knowledge, and then opening up the space for the other person to get to know them well. And what a beautiful honor and intention that somebody wants to know you and they're not trying to pretend that they don't notice that you may be different.
Yes, I love that. And I love this idea of common ground that we keep coming to. I'll just say briefly that I currently live in Pennsylvania, which was a battleground state in the last election, as you may know. So there were a lot of very negative signs around. And one day I was driving up to a T in a road. There was a cornfield in front of me, and there was just one sign, and that sign said, "Find common ground." And the fact that someone put that sign out helped get me through that season. So finding common ground. And again, you spoke a little bit about religion and regions, family, and understanding that everyone's family is different and things like that. And so that also brings me into the always fun area of discussion of dating. So I'm kind of curious, about dating. So, as a mother of young adult children, I'm sure you've had some thinking about this, but also just people in general. So, we're talking about the Daisy community, Daisy roots. And that could be that someone has come over from another country temporarily, permanently, whatever, but it could be recently. Or it could be that those folks have been born here, but of course, cultures are going to influence them and be a big part of their lives. So I'm kind of curious about what you can tell me about dating in the Daisy community, maybe for younger people, first generation, high school students, if in your understanding the restrictions are different from restrictions placed on younger people dating here. I'm just sort of curious about all of it.
That is a fantastic question. I'll tell you that it is so diverse, Jennifer, and I will give you examples from the most conservative to the most liberal. So the quick answer is it depends. It depends on how conservative the parents are. So if the parents are conservative, dating is not a thing. A lot of our kids have to hide their romantic life from the parent because a lot of the parents and conservative parents from Bangladesh, India, and Pakistan, that's what I'm saying, religion then becomes diffused and culture takes over because conservative Hindus, Christians, Muslims from South Asia present all the same. And that means no dating, no possibility of dating anybody outside your subculture. So if you are Indian Christian, you will only want your kid to date Indian Christian or be with. And so because dating culturally is not as acceptable, not common, parents, even in high school kids, automatically assume that the eventual result is going to be marriage, and they get very scared. So they do not want to. So a Pakistani would want the child to date a Pakistani. The Bangladeshi will want the child to. So even within, when it comes to dating, it becomes very complicated in the conservative portion. Now, the more liberal, educated, open-minded you become, then there is a lot of comfort. So liberal Muslim families, liberal Hindu families, liberal Bangladeshi families, no issue with, dating from your culture. They notice they're acculturated, they've lived here long enough, or they have more liberal views. And this is where religion also plays a role, especially for the Muslim families. So it's, a spectrum. I will say that liberal spectrum is very small in the larger percentage. Moderate spectrum is significant, and the conservative spectrum is significant. So as a result of that, our kids really struggle because a lot of the parents will not allow them to go to prom, to homecoming. They will not have permission to hang out with guy friends, even sometimes to work on a project. And so there will be a lot of curfews, limitations, and that cause a lot of challenges for our kiddos. And so the first time they're actually able to do something in that space is actually in college, not in high school, because they're still living with their parents.
Yeah. So it sounds, again, common ground, progressive or liberal versus conservative. That sounds very familiar. And speaking of that, and speaking of dating and young people, what is a take, or is there a general take, or is it sort of similar variance on people in the GLBTQIA community?
So I'll tell you, that's another very challenging space because culturally accepting that your child could be gay is very hard for the community. So only the liberal elements are okay and accepting. Even the moderate and the conservatives struggle with it a lot. And unfortunately, depending on how tough the parenting model is and how religious the family is, there's a lot of abandonment, there's a lot of alienation, there's a lot of stigma that goes with it. And parents actually feel very responsible, like they did something wrong, which ended up with their child being gay. And, gay kids struggle a lot. And from a mental health perspective, my heart goes out to them because they're trying to make sense of their own lives, especially at a tender age when they're in high school or even in college. So coming out becomes very tough. The more strict religious the family is, the more difficult it is. And so there's a lot of struggle in that space in the community.
We've spoken a lot about young people. What about more seasoned people? What is I don't want to say the dating scene, that sounds weird, but
no, you can say that.
The dating scene. But I'm kind of, I'm interested in sort of the difference in adult romantic relationships, married or unmarried or dating, and how that might compare to your understanding of the larger culture?
So I'll tell you, for the South Asian population, most, if not all, adult romantic relationships have a goal, and that's marriage.
Hmm.
So it's a very clear thing that you are dating with the purpose of finding a life partner in marriage. And I will tell you that a lot of times they see adults struggle a lot because they might like somebody from outside of the culture or even from a different subculture. And then after they realize, oh, how wonderful this person is for me, the second thing is, oh my God, they will be a disaster when they meet or oh my God, there is no compatibility. Because remember, the immigration journey of South Asians is very different from, for example, the Mexican American population, so they're so driven and career focused that parents are heavily invested in how this child is going to land. And so marriage is also a part of that framework.
Interesting. Well, and that leads to another question. One of the questions I was going to ask that I think the larger population might be interested in as well. I have thought about if I moved to another country, I would probably only do it for a short time. And so I'm interested in why people come here in general. And in this case, the Desi community, what's the draw? Because I know that you're, as you said very specifically and elegantly, the immigration journey is different.
So absolutely. So a little bit of history perspective, and of course, I'm not an expert in that, but it was, I think, after the mid 60s, 1965 is when, the laws on immigration and the discrimination in America kind of changed, where they were open to Europeans and Asians migrating here for livelihood, for education. So once that happened, in the late 60s and 70s is when the first generation of South Asians mostly started migrating, and it was for better jobs and for education. So, most of it was legal immigration as those programs were put in place, inviting people from different professions, from different categories of, work and careers that were needed in the US. And so a lot of the Desi population from India and Pakistan started coming here and started settling. And a big goal was, that financial relief that you would get, in that you could live simply in the US, take care of your household, and then still be able to send money home to afford a better life for your family.
Yeah, and these are high demand jobs we're talking about. Like you and I were laughing a couple of days ago, like everybody has a South Asian doctor.
Yes.
Everybody has a South Asian doctor.
Absolutely. It's like your doctor most of the time is, nobody would be without, because right now, as I understand, almost 25% of the physician population in the US is South Asian region, 20 to 25%. Yes. So absolutely. So there's a lot. And now there is a huge and significant population of South Asians who are business owners. I mean, it's really huge and significant. And then, of course, hospitality. So hotel industry, you find a huge percentage of, South Asians in that space. So education is a big, big element. And you will see, very few people who are from South Asian descent, very few. Probably I would make up a number in the single digits of people who are not educated. So huge drive.
Yeah. So we spoke a little bit earlier about a Christmas tree. When I was visiting you about a year and a half ago, I saw a picture of you and your kids with a Christmas tree, and I remember thinking, "Oh, I love that," but not because I'm assuming you weren't celebrating Christmas and a Christian way, but like myself, for me, it's about the kind of the not necessarily the Christian part of Christmas. Not that there's anything wrong with that. Culturally, I'm all good with all of the different holidays, but I like the solstice and the evergreen and the light returning in the depth of winter. And I love when people sort of enjoy whatever part of whatever holiday works for them. So your picture, I thought, was just lovely. I wish we had it right now. We would put it up on the screen and let everyone see it. But I was wondering, what are your favorite holidays? What are your favorite Muslim holidays? Or if there are other holidays that you like, that you enjoy. I mean, I love Christmas, I love Easter, but again, it's not specifically the religious part. It's the surrounding part, the fun part, the deeper meaning. Do you have any favorite holidays?
Oh my God, there's so many. And I want to make sure that I also contextualize this a lot of times. So I do have a Christmas tree every year. And there is a cultural component. Again, we're looking at culture, and I'm living in the American culture, right? And this is a big holiday that hardly any of us can escape. So
Sorry.
Yes, it's huge. It's significant here. And so I will tell you that, it's interesting that I landed in this space, but I think the seeds were sowed back home where I was born and raised in Pakistan in a very liberal, educated home and I think I've shared this with you, Jen, and it informs my work in that my dad had a library. We had like a sitting room, and in that library was a Bible, a Torah, a Bhagavad Gita, a Quran, all of these holy book of Buddha, all next to each other. And we were
Hmm.
Muslims. And so I asked my dad one day, and most, if not all of my close friends know this story, that, why we're Muslims, why do we have all these books? And he said, so when you go out in the world and interact with these people, you know that it's all the same. And you have
Hmm.
to respect each and every one of them
I
if you're going to make friends in the world.
love that.
So that was that. And so the cultural element of that. So when we were in Pakistan, we were the majority culture. But guess what? We had Hindu friends, we had Christian friends, we had the ugliest Christmas tree that would come out in Pakistan growing up, that would come out. We would be invited to Diwali and Holi parties. And this is in Pakistan, Muslim Pakistan. And my dad, because he went to a Zoroastrian school, he
Hmm.
then had chances to interact with and make friends with people from all faiths. So we grew up around all of that. So I embrace the idea that when you live in a country, you embrace elements of it and they do not define your faith belief.
Hmm.
So when my sister's best friend, who was Christian, got married, she had two events. And in one event, she was wearing red, which is a bridal color for our culture. And then her
Hmm.
church wedding, she was wearing white clothes. So it's really how you frame it. Now, I will say I've gotten a lot of heat from loved ones from having that Christmas tree. So thank you for outing me on this podcast. But there is a cultural frame of reference here. The holidays that I love that are from the Muslim community, Islam, I love the month of Ramadan. It's the month of giving. It's coming up. You fast. You really get a moment to reflect on your privilege and work on self-control and on your conscience. And then the celebration after that, which is called Eid, is one of my
Hmm.
favorites. It's a beautiful celebration of food, merriment with friends and family. So I love that. In the Hindu culture, I love Diwali and I love Holi. It's the festival of colors. It is
Hmm.
the most amazing, amazing, fun-filled event. And I've taken so every year when my kids were growing up, I would take them to a different faith place of worship and expose them to the holidays. And so that's my favorite from there. So it's, a lot of different Nowruz from the Zoroastrian faith is a beautiful, spring festival that Zoroastrians celebrate. So I have a lot of favorite holidays. I'm like a holiday person. You give me a holiday and I'm
I love
happy
holidays. I
to
love food. I
celebrate.
love lights, all of that. That
But I
sounds
want to make sure that I'm respecting, everyone who's listening. That's really not a best practice even. How you carry out your faith is completely up to you. And, I want to respect everyone's beliefs. It's not, I'm a Muslim, identify as a Muslim, and my kids do as well. But yeah, we love holidays.
me too. So we were talking a little bit about, we wanted to talk a little bit about the workplace and Daisy folks in the workplace here and how Americans might consider, and when I say Americans, I'm just using a shorthand of sort of a mainstream, kind of an average. I have the privilege of having always lived and worked in quite liberal places that are very considerate about things like food and touching. I work in universities where I know, for example, I would never touch a student without asking permission first, even if it's just a pat on the shoulder. So I guess I started thinking about how people might want to know how they could be a little bit more sensitive and open and inclusive by understanding that everyone does things differently, that anybody can do things differently. And there are ways that assuming that they might do things differently is inclusive, right? So, can you tell me a little bit about how sort of an average workplace might adjust its habits to be more considerate and to be more inclusive with things like food, holiday parties, touching, hugging? A lot of Americans are great big huggers. Ideas like potluck, anything like that that might be interesting to you.
Thank you for asking that question. There has been so much growth in our communities in general, but I will tell you definitely when you are interacting with a Desi person, there are three, four elements to consider, especially in the workplace.
Mm.
Is an easy one where a lot of times when it's pizza night or pizza is ordered for the company and it ends up being pepperoni pizza, you've basically othered more than half of the Hindu population and almost everyone in the Muslim population because many Hindus are vegetarian and most, if not all, Muslims do not eat pork. So just having some information about dietary restrictions of your colleagues would be such a beautiful gesture in terms of food. And needless to say, if we go into specifics, well, the Jain culture, there are other vegetables that they don't eat as well. And so being curious and asking is the best response instead of making assumptions because three people who are Desi or are not differentiating between who's Muslim and Hindu because there are religious practices that play a role. Touching also is one of them, from the conservative to moderate to liberal, where it is very indicative and the best place to learn is to notice your colleague's body language. If they're the ones initiating touch, then it's okay to touch. Otherwise, it's not, especially opposite gender touching. So that's where you want to be careful. Same gender is not as risque as is opposite gender touching, whether it's a pat on the back, whether it is a hug, or whether it is, there's a lot of awkwardness and it may not have much to do with even faith. So, for example, but cultural upbringing is to maintain that body language of reservation with the opposite gender. That's culturally appropriate. It's something to remember when it comes to touch. Also, any kind of jokes. So humor, especially humor that is risque, sexual undertones. Not everyone has the palate to be able to consume that. So being sensitive, even if you're with a guy friend or colleague, you want to just see their comfort level. But when it is in the presence of the opposite gender, it becomes even more uncomfortable. So women might be able to joke about those things in front of other women. When there's a man present, it might be difficult. And same goes for men. So there's a lot of gender-based sensitivity in the culture that you may want to read the room before you initiate.
Yeah, that reminds me of high and low context in intercultural communications, but we'll talk about that another time. But I'm going to go backwards a little bit. So I'm imagining a workplace party, and we were thinking about food. And again, I'm very privileged that I've always worked in places where there's always a vegetarian, vegan, gluten-free option, all of that sort of thing. But I'm thinking about food now. As I believe, food is a great way to show love and hospitality. And I was wondering if you could tell me about what inspired you to start Dil Ki Recipes.
Oh, that's such a sweet question. So as you know that you understand the word recipes. And so Dil Ki Recipes in Hindi or Urdu means recipes of the heart. It resonated with me because human beings are centered around and feel deeply and positively around human connection. And that's connecting hearts. And so in my work as a multicultural therapist and counselor and coach, I noticed that there is a specific recipe that works for every individual. And that's a very customized recipe. So Jennifer, what you may find beautiful in terms of a love language may not be the same as somebody who's very similar to you. And a lot of relationships are healthy and wholesome when you figure that recipe out. So it just resonated with me because when people come and do their work with me, especially in the romantic relationship space, especially in familial relationships, there's a recipe. There's a mom and there's a way to show that mom your love. And that's her recipe. And there's a couple where there's some sensitivities that the one partner grew up with that means love to them, like food you mentioned. It becomes a love language in many of our cultural dispositions. So figuring out those recipes has pretty much been my profession. So the name resonated with me.
I love it. Are you going to share it on this podcast?
Absolutely. So I would hope that people who are listening can follow on Instagram and TikTok and look for dilkirecipes.com, because this is very specific to the Desi diaspora. If you have friends from South Asia who have heritage, cultural roots there, please go ahead, follow me on social media that you prefer, on Facebook, on YouTube. Also, Spotify has the podcast. Hopefully, Apple will have them starting in a couple of weeks. And again, it's just a platform that is hoping to bring the community together and help South Asians and people of South Asian descent know that they're not alone in some of the challenges that are bicultural and very unique to them. And this is also an opportunity for us, especially in North America and people living in all parts of the world, to have a better understanding of each other, which is why I invited you, Jennifer, and I hope that you can also join in future conversations. So different people get to learn different elements about our community. Jennifer, I wanted to ask you a question before we wrap up. And my question was, how do you, because a lot of Americans are not as friendly, as open-minded, as graceful as my experience of you in being curious, being culturally curious, being so respectful and so honoring of different cultures. How did you become the Jennifer I know and admire so much?
I'm not exactly sure how to answer that. I think part of it was that I grew up in a pretty diverse neighborhood. I spent my childhood in a suburb of Washington, D.C., about 10 miles outside of Washington, D.C. And while it was primarily white when I was very, very young, it diversified a lot. And I can remember when Jimmy Carter, I'm very sad, has passed. I'm not. He was just such a wonderful man. He initiated busing that brought kids from inner city Washington, D.C. out to the suburbs. And that was a way to help everybody. And it did. I think I'm privileged in that I had, I think, a lot of diversity in my life very young. And that was part of it. I learned differences. I learned from kids who were not the same as me. But then later I moved, and then I moved again, and I moved to a big city. And I just loved it. I love the people. I love the differences. I studied cultural anthropology as an undergrad and psychology that I've used my whole life. And it's just sort of a natural curiosity. But also because, when I moved to New York when I was very young. And I was in community with lots and lots of young people from all over the world. None of us had any money. Everybody was taking, wait staff jobs and things like that. We were just out having an adventure. And nobody was hurting each other, and it was intentional. Like, we all wanted to be there, we all wanted to have adventure, we all wanted to meet people, and that's just not how life is a lot of the time. People grow up in their compartments, and I think it's a wonderful thing when kids take off. Not just kids, right? But we have more energy when we're kids. We take off and have an adventure and seek things out and seek out new people and put yourself in situations that are different and new and not necessarily dangerous, but certainly not necessarily same old, same old. Sort of live with an open heart and be willing to make mistakes. I make mistakes. I've offended people I haven't wanted to. I've always tried, but I've always asked. And especially when I was younger, people would let me get away with being stupid or asking questions that were not well contextualized and not necessarily sensitive of where the other person might be coming from. But when I was 20 years old, people would see and understand. And I was asking people from all over the world all kinds of questions, and they would answer them and they would help me. I forgot to tell you, I was also a messenger at the United Nations when I was like 20 years old. And that was an amazing experience. So the more diversity you let into your life, the more you want. The more you get, the more you know, the more love from everybody. I don't really know how to explain it.
I think you explained it so well. Thank you so much, Jennifer, for being here with me. This is why it's so important to keep learning new things and better ways of communicating in all our relationships and friendships, so our minds and our hearts keep growing. Well, that's all I have for now. Thank you so much for joining me. I hope you found some of our information useful, some things and gentle reminders for everyone listening. Every situation is different. Issues are not resolved overnight. And the most important thing that needs to change is you and your approach, and not others. Because when you know better, you do better. Do seek therapy, counseling, coaching. Whenever you can, be kind to yourself and those around you. And remember one thing that you're grateful for every day. Plan to find a reason to laugh. And I hope you continue joining me on these episodes of Dil Ki Recipe. Please remember to subscribe and follow me on your favorite social media platform. Wishing you peace and talk to you soon.